Truth-Driven Thinking number 87, Morality and Meaning Apart from God, with Luke Muehlhauser.
Knowledge is the difference between love and mass murder. You can't do anything unless you get a little further. Knowledge is the difference between love and mass murder. You can't do anything unless you get a little further.
And welcome back once again to Truth-Driven Thinking, where it really is about the journey and the freedom to ask the tough questions about how the world really works, tough questions of ourselves and about others that we're here for. I am Stephen Gibson, and the older I get, the less I know. I don't pretend to have any lock on truth here, not in a million years. But I do think how one estimates truth is important. And that means intellectually honest exploration. All things can be questioned if done so politely and with an eye on finding truth, setting aside ego, and using evidence, reason, and science in order to fulfill our broader mission, which is to improve the well-being of humanity through the promotion of social, emotional, and intellectual growth. So I should add that in this all-new program, we're hoping you will sponsor us in part by your membership and participation at the new Truth.Bloomfire social learning community located at truth.bloomfire.com. A great reason to join is really simply to support our mission here, our ministry, if you will, with a small monthly contribution. You can consider this episode your weekly sermon if we want to use the metaphors and the language that we're used to here. But hopefully there's also much in it for you to participate in this social video intensive peer learning experience, as we're calling it. Way more than a forum. It's a learning community, safe, intellectually honest environment where Grandma doesn't have to see your Facebook posts on sex, God, or politics and economics, and that you get to see and hear extended interviews with some of our guests, get some free perks and merchandise, I should mention, and kind of watch us assemble this ongoing video archive of explanations and exchanges with people like you, and we'd love to have you there. But today we are talking about morality and meaning apart from God, and I'll let today's guest speak for himself, but as a lifelong Christian and someone very committed myself to being kind and good, the mere thought of morality without God would have sent my brain spinning just 7 or 8 years ago. Today I'm fortunate to be able to explore this topic with a very bright thinker and philosopher who's had his own journey from dogmatic religion to what, if I may, I will call truth-driven goals or methods. Luke Muehlhauser is an independent philosopher and writer. He's the author of CommonSenseAtheism.com and the host of the podcast Conversations from the Pale Blue Dot. He currently works for the Singularity Institute for Artificial Intelligence, doing philosophy research and teaching classes on rationality and social skills. He also co-hosts the Morality in the Real World podcast with Alonzo Fyfe, which cleverly and succinctly lays out their arguments for a philosophy and description of morality called desire utilitarianism. I'll try to channel Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill here, though I'm a philosophy neophyte, as many of you know. So we will have some fun, and I want to welcome to the program Luke Muehlhauser. Welcome, Luke.
Thanks, Steve. It's great to be here.
Well, very nice to be able to talk with you and connect all these little dots of places I've heard your name previously and come across your website. We'll get to all of that, but why don't we start at the beginning? We all have kind of our backgrounds and our biases that make us who we are. You identify, I think, according to your website, as an atheist, and since about 2008, I think it says, you gave up your prior faith, but can you share with us just a bit about your background and your story in that regard?
Right. I think I have a story that is fairly common in the United States according to the latest statistics, and that is that I grew up a born-again Christian in an evangelical household in the Midwest, and my father is actually a pastor, and we went on short-term missionary trips to England and China and Indonesia to tell all the atheists over there about Jesus. and I was very enthused about my relationship with God and the things that He was doing in my life, and I just wanted to serve God with my life. And I got to the point where I think around age 20, I wanted to do nothing else with my life but be like Jesus to a lost and hurting world. And that meant that I had to know something about what it would be like to be like Jesus, because different people had different pictures of who Jesus was. So I started to study the historical Jesus and what conservative Christian scholars said about Jesus. And what I learned very quickly was that their picture of who Jesus was quite different from the Jesus I had been told about from the pew on Sundays.
Sure.
And I was really surprised by this. And not only that, but that the things that I learned that were surprising to me were things that my father had been taught in seminary, and that pastors are standardly trained in seminary, but it's not something that they seem to share from the pew because maybe it would be damaging to people's faith or something like that. But just kind of standard knowledge, like most of the New Testament consists of known forgeries. The claimed authors are not the actual authors. Things like the mission of Paul was quite different than the mission of Jesus, and what we know of as Christianity today is more closely linked to what Paul thought than to what Jesus thought. That there are really obvious contradictions between the different books of the New Testament and definitely the Old Testament, which is exactly what you would expect if you understand that the Bible was written by dozens or hundreds of people over several thousands of years by people from 2 and perhaps 3 different religions. But it's not what you would expect if it has a single inspiring author in God. And these are things that are taught rather standardly in seminary, but things that I had never heard before. So this was quite surprising to me, and I started to read Christian apologetics to bolster my faith and recover my faith, and have really smart people tell me that it was all okay, and that these objections, these new bits of knowledge didn't really mean anything, and I could just go on being a Christian. And this led me into philosophy of religion, because I wanted to know what Christian philosophers said as well about not just the historical Jesus, but about the existence of God in general. And I knew that to be kind of fair, I should read maybe a little bit of what the other side had to say about this. And so I read a couple things by atheists, like there's a book by Dan Barker, Losing Faith in Faith, that was really influential to me. And then there's some online writings and atheist radio shows and that kind of thing. And I had this experience of discovering that everything the atheists said was really simple and fair and just common sense. And the smartest Christian apologists had to do amazing intellectual backflips to defend the propositions at the center of the Christian faith, like this Jewish carpenter was God and rose from the dead and had magical powers and like all these amazing things that don't make sense at all unless you've been raised in this Christian bubble where they were just reinforced all the time.
Luke, so I'm sorry, what age roughly was this for you?
Yeah, I think it was about age 21, 22. When I tell the story, I find myself sometimes getting the dates wrong, but the lucky thing is that all of this happened while I was blogging. And so this is all recorded on the internet.
Very good.
My deconversion. So I actually can look it up and be like, oh, no, this was actually, I was 22. Right? I honestly can't remember now.
Your mission work and that type of, so at 21, 20 to 22 in there, you had certainly been, when was your mission work? As a teenager growing up, I assume, if your father was a pastor?
Yeah, there were a few as a teenager, and I actually went on one Christian missionary trip to Indonesia while I was an atheist. I had just deconverted, and my father was running a trip to Indonesia and said, I need some help with some technical things, and if you come along, I'll pay for half of your flight. And I was like, well, I don't believe in the mission anymore, but I would like to visit Indonesia. So I went along and just helped him and tried not to be too conspicuous about my lack of faith.
Yeah, well, that sounds interesting in and of itself. Let me come back to the social aspects in just a second here, but certainly your story does sound familiar. I sit right in the eye shot here is the Baker Encyclopedia of Christian Apologetics, and I'm sure nowhere near at your level, but I joked with Bishop Spong in a couple of our conversations that he wrecked me on on literalist belief. But tell me, your story also reminds me, you mentioned Dan Barker, reminds me a lot of Bart Ehrman's work. Ehrman, and I was just reading in one of his books that I'd not read before, and where he makes the point that you made, which is these things are in seminaries. I think sometimes it's puzzling to some of these scholars. It's puzzling to them why we lay people sitting in the. I think Price has used the term pew potato. Why we in the pews don't get at some of this more esoteric scholarship. Any thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, there's actually I think some of it may be what I said before about preachers not wanting to scare the flock, because faith is very fragile in the modern secularizing world. And so if the pew potatoes knew what they knew, they wouldn't have the resources to maintain their faith like the pastors and the preachers and the people who have been through seminary do. So that may be part of the worry. Another potential cause of this lack of information is that the point of churches today is not about information in the way that it was 50 years ago, or especially 100 or 150 years ago.
Interesting.
It's mostly about motivation and basically just kind of self-help, but a particular supernatural type of self-help. And so feeding people information, if you want to fill the pews, you can't educate them. People don't want to come to education on Sunday morning. They want to come on inspiring motivational speakers. And so I think that's another reason for the general dumbing down of the church, is just the pragmatics of bringing enough people in to pay the tithe, to pay for the large building.
Kind of the Joel Osteen criticism here.
Exactly. And he's a more extreme example. He's especially stripped of theology, but I think all churches are feeling this pressure.
Yeah, fair enough. Well, and so as to not go too far down that road, but I was curious on your thoughts, having been brought up in it. And tell me a little bit more then about, I'm always curious about the social aspects, as Dan Barker talked about in his books, and on Oprah and that type of thing as a megachurch pastor. But how was it for you as a pastor's son, who obviously felt this very deeply? I'm sure this was not an easy family transition for your parents or you.
It wasn't. I remember the day that I decided I was going to tell my father that I no longer believed in God. And we were driving to watch The Fountain, which is this movie by Darren Aronofsky. And I told him in the car on the way that I just couldn't believe in God anymore. And we both sat in the cinema, and our faces were pointed to the screen, but I don't think either of us knew a single thing that happened during the movie.
Yeah, sure.
Because this was very upsetting for him, and it was very upsetting for me as well, because I had been told that without God, there is no meaning or purpose or morality. The world is just atoms bouncing around, and none of it matters. And so I believed that. I just couldn't unlearn the things that I had learned. And so I was very distraught. My father was very distraught. And on the way back from the movie, he told me, Luke, I'm just so worried about you. And he started to cry. And this was a very hard time for us, a very hard time for me. I was quite depressed for a couple of months. And then eventually I figured out that, well, wait a minute. Hundreds of millions of atheists have lived lives of incredible purpose and morality and meaning for thousands and thousands of years. And so eventually this lifted my depression, and I started to do what all of the other atheists in the world are doing, which is living out lives of meaning and purpose and morality. You got people like Bill Gates and Warren Buffett, who are the greatest philanthropists in the history of the solar system, and they are both atheists. You've got tons of people throughout history who were able to make a positive impact on the world and live lives of, the most meaningful lives in the history of the world, who didn't do it by believing in deities.
Yeah, boy, I appreciate you sharing your story too, because I think back to where I was 7 or 8 years ago, and I can't even imagine in Dan Barker's shoes or in your shoes. I think even though in my situation, and still to this day, there's no question that it is isolating to live in a culture. West Michigan's pretty Dutch Christian Reformed and Reformed Church of America dominant. My children had to deal with my fairly public transition. And so I can't imagine in your situation. I do appreciate you sharing that, because it helps others who are going through that to kind of know that it's not the end of the world, but it can seem pretty isolating, can it not?
Yeah, it certainly can. I grew up in this Christian bubble in rural Minnesota, and when I deconverted, I didn't really have many relationships with people who didn't believe in God. And so I didn't lose my social circle, but certainly our relationships couldn't be on the same level as they were before. And it was funny, when I came out as an atheist to the wider public, there was at the same time some members of the board of the church for which my father is a pastor, who came out as Catholics, and so we, as opposed to Protestants, and so we kind of bonded as these new outcasts in the community.
Yes.
So that was kind of fun. But very quickly I was able to find other people who didn't believe in gods, and gain some social support from them. But it's tough, and I think for a lot of people, are in a much harder position than I was, because if you're life partner is a believer, yes, or if you have children, I mean, that's a more difficult situation. But I'm actually surprised by how many people will talk to me because they've recently deconverted, and I ask, well, are you married? Do you have children? And they say, yes. And it was hard, but we're actually managing all right. And so that's very encouraging to me, but I had it much easier than that.
Yeah, well, it's in each experience is unique, but one thing that intrigues me about that is it sounds like you were among some pretty loving and intellectually honest people, to the extent that you didn't lose your family or your friends over that, and I think that's a credit to all of you.
Yeah, it could have been a lot worse. I know that some people are in a situation, for example, particularly if they're Mormon, where coming out is going to have really massively negative effects.
Sure.
And so those people need to be particularly strategic about how they come out. They probably should come out as a non-believer, because it's really difficult and frustrating to live a lie and pretend to be somebody that you're not for decades. But those people need to plug into communities of non-believers and get some social support around them before they come out and potentially lose important contacts in their life.
Yeah, absolutely, for sure. Well, moving on here, and I appreciate you sharing that, because, again, I think it has value. You obviously, common sense atheism. You don't have any problem with the term atheism, I'm assuming. Is that fair, that you identify that way? You don't care to dance around and call it a non-theistic outlook or anything like that?
Sure. I mean, actually, the reason that I titled my website Common Sense Atheism is because I was wanting to ride the wave of popularity around the new atheism at the time that the website launched, and that worked very successfully for me. But now I actually, I'm certainly an atheist. That just, like most of the people that I hang out with now, that's just a given, like as opposed to what? Magic? But I really more identify with a naturalist, which is kind of like an atheist plus all of these other things. But atheism certainly describes me, just like tall white male describes me.
Sure, and actually our last guest was Tom Clark from the Center for Naturalism.
Yeah, he's awesome. I've had a lot of conversations with him.
Yeah, he's been very kind. He's been very kind on our Bloomfire as well, exchanging some ideas with people. But yeah, that was certainly my follow-up question, as atheist tells you what you are not. So I don't find it to be a horribly useful term, but you've given me the context there. In fact, I'll ask you too, and I know it's on your website, but common sense atheism, tell me a little bit more about that, because you asked the question of yourself. So are you saying that it's common sense to be an atheist?
It's a good question. It's not the best title for a blog, I think, in retrospect, but what I intended to communicate at first when I launched the blog with Common Sense Atheism was that if you apply the same kind of thinking that you do to the rest of your life, to your finances, to your career decisions, then and you apply that type of thinking to your religion, you will end up an atheist. The way that you can maintain your religion is that you give special privilege to a particular religious tradition that you were brought up in. And this is very natural for humans to do. I mean, this is just the way that the brain works, and you either have to get lucky or you have to specifically train and read neuroscience and cognitive biases literature and understand that this is how the brain works in order to overcome it. So it's not like a terrible, unusual fault if you have this partition in your mind such that you treat your finances with a different logic than you treat your religion. But when you understand how the brain works and that the brain does that, and you apply the same type of logic that you do to your finances to your religion, I think people will end up an atheist. And so if you use the sense that is common to the rest of your thinking on your religion, then I think people will lose their religion. And so that's what I meant by common sense atheism. But obviously, unless people have read those articles where I try to explain that, the first assumption will be, well, what do you mean? Do you mean atheism is common sense? And, well, I mean, just literally, no, it's not, because most people are still theists of some kind or another. So it's not the common sense. So I mean this other specific thing about it.
Sure.
And actually, more recently, my blog has moved on to discuss other topics besides religion. And so now it kind of has a third meaning, which is that, atheism is so basic and we need to just move on and tackle the actually difficult problems of the world, the things that we don't have the answer to. Like, people are still debating this, but does God exist? Well, no. The answer is no, and we know this, and we can move on to things that we don't know, like, which decision theory is correct, and that kind of thing.
Which is well said, and that's a great point, and that's very much what I'm at this point trying to do with what I'll call my ministry too, is talk about the things we're going to talk from this point forward about, which is living fully. And,
morality and meaning is one problem that hasn't really been solved. Those are tough questions, and we need to devote cognitive processing time to those rather than to endlessly rehashing the debates around religion. But I will say that I really do appreciate the people who are still, I call it, fighting the good fight.
Agreed.
People like John Loftus, because it's because of those people that I escaped the Christian dogma.
I'm sorry. I think it's fair, too, to your point, to as we alluded to earlier, to recognize that this was new to us 7 or 8 years ago. This is not new to people today. It's real. It's a big thing. And I'll continue to explore the beauty of what I see as, in a Joseph Campbellian way, the scriptures and the, I mean this word with honor and respect, the metaphors and myths that have such deep meaning to so many people. And I assume that you wouldn't consider yourself anti-religion in any way. Is that fair?
No, I'm definitely anti-religion in the same way that I'm, anti-homeopathy. Religion is much more destructive of human goals than homeopathy. And just the fact that it's really incredibly false. When people have better models of the world, they're better able to achieve their goals. And I see a lot of damage coming out of religion. But it's not all bad, So there's some good that comes out of religion. There's some random good that comes out of homeopathy as well, placebo effects and so on.
Interesting.
So I'm definitely anti-religion in the same way that I'm, if people were taking Norse mythology like seriously and acting their life on the basis of it and structuring their life so that they thought they would achieve, that they would enter Valhalla at the end of their life, and did this instead of, using science to make medical decisions about what to do with their children, then I would be anti-Norse mythology. And so for those same reasons, I'm anti-religion.
Interesting. Can we not kind of, again, to cite Joseph Campbell, can we not find the bits and pieces and kind of pick and choose among, kind of like we do among popular movies, to say, gosh, that mythology resonates with me. It gives us a common language. It gives us a way to kind of closely use metaphor and myth, again, which we screw up by making it literally true. But isn't there, to me, there's value in religion in that sense, that we can talk about in metaphor what it means to forgive, what it means to find transcendence or salvation.
Sure, I think so. I continuously use metaphors from, say, The Matrix or sci-fi novels or ancient Greek mythology. I talk about Odysseus tying himself to the mast to avoid the temptation of the sirens when I talk about overcoming, setting goals and overcoming procrastination. So we can certainly use these cultural symbols to communicate with other people in a way that resonates more deeply and strongly and effectively than if we just talk about abstract general principles in plain language all of the time.
Sure.
Yeah, so I definitely, and it's funny, I was speaking with a Bible scholar who, as far as I can tell, is an atheist, but he calls himself a Christian because he's a liberal Christian, and he identifies with it in metaphorical sense. And I said, in a way I'm envious of you, because you get to have conversations with people and correct their thinking in a way that I can't, because they won't listen to me. Because the way I talk is about God not existing. And the way you talk is using the metaphors of Christianity, but then, for example, deprogramming them from prejudice against homosexuals. And they'll listen to you and they won't listen to me.
That point is excellent. And I've thought the same thing with Bishop Spong, with whom I don't think I can find a point of divergence with him between my thinking and his at this point. And I've had such wonderful conversations with him after 70 years of studying this stuff. Yet he can fill churches and talk in churches. And I've found that, I have a couple pastor friends who've invited me in, and that's been a wonderful experience. But boy, I don't expect to find that often. I've not had much luck with that kind of dialogue. Yeah, Spong is another excellent example of being able to have conversations that you and I probably cannot. Yeah, we got a little. I pulled us off track again, but that's an interesting observation for sure. So where were we going there? Let's keep going down this. Obviously, one of the biggest questions that we face is this question of, how can you have morality without God? What's your standard answer to that?
Well, it's unfortunately I don't have a short one. I actually have to start with linguistics in order to talk about morality, because the way that humans use words is really problematic a lot of the time. And so I have to unprogram some bad habits before I can really talk about something that is as confusing as morality. And so I will actually start talking about linguistics first. And I'll talk about how we need to be wary of our word tools that we're using to communicate, because it's very tempting to use words in a way that doesn't really connect to reality. And so, for example, I guess I'll go this way. People use words to have lots of different meanings. And some people use the word morally good to mean that which is going to maximize pleasure in human beings. And some people use the word morally good to mean that which is commanded by this particular deity. And some people use the phrase morally good to mean that which accords to the principles we would hypothetically agree to behind a veil of ignorance. And some people use the word morally good not even to assert any statement at all, but to say,